With this presentation, I'd like to discuss somewhat at length the causes of the American Civil War, because we're getting down to the last 2 weeks of classes, and the Civil War will take up at least the last week and a half. And I think that anybody would agree that the American Civil War was the seminal event for the United States of the 19th century. There were a number of reasons. Throughout the century and a half since then, there have been many reasons given, but there were really only a few. And I'll start with number one, the extension of slave states. As the United States grew, as we saw in the last slideshow, that the United States was growing more and more to the west, and they were taking territories, and they called them territories, and then each individual territory had the option of becoming a state if they wanted to, and then when they became a state, they could vote to be a free state, or I'll get into this later, or a slave state. So the newly acquired territory from Mexico becomes slave states. And should it become the problem was, or the question was, if these areas became slave states, then there were more representation of slave states in the Congress, in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate. Who should decide whether it becomes a slave state or a free state? And eventually it would have to be the people who lived there. And it happened frequently that when a state was ready to vote free or slave, a lot of people from other states moved in quickly or to be there to vote one way or the other. The second reason, states' rights versus federal rights. The North believed that the federal government was the most powerful, and it says in the Constitution in Bill of Rights number 10 that any laws not specific to the authority of the federal government belong to the state. And the South believed that states' rights should prevail over those of the federal government. And this was an argument that had been going on since the ratification of the Constitution in 1788 and the Bill of Rights in 1789. Sectional economic differences, I think that this had a lot to do with it. You take an agricultural community or an agricultural county or an agricultural country, and another one is an industrial, fast-growing, lots of diversity. The agricultural places tend not to have much diversity, and you have a clash of cultures. The North was aided by protective tariffs that were specific to protect the industries of the North. I lived my last years in the States in Massachusetts, and there are mill towns. I lived in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and Framingham. I didn't live there, but there are mill towns everywhere in New England, New Hampshire, southern Maine, Connecticut, Rhode Island, and this was the business. This was the industry of the United States. The South was not. The South had hardly any industry whatsoever. It was agriculture, and it was farming, and it was cotton, and it was tobacco based, supported by the slave culture. It was effective at the time while it supported the northern interest, and the tariffs hurt the South. Abolition. Northerners, in their righteousness, believed, many Northerners, not all, that slavery was wrong, and that black people should be free, and that was it. If you remember in your reading about the second evangelical rise in the 1820s and 1830s in the United States, the abolitionists used their newspapers and their little flyers, they called them, organizations, legislation, rebellion. John Brown, I'll get to John Brown in a minute. They taught abolition in schools. People were escaping and being transported or helped to escape north to Canada through the Underground Railroad. And then there's, which we'll discuss in a minute, Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sectionalism, this is what I was talking about. These two areas of the United States developed differently between, let's say, 1800 and 1820 or 30, even later, and they were just had different cultures. The Southerners thought that they were, of course, you're talking about the oligarchy. The Southerners thought that they were the genteel, upper class people that had a lot of manners and traditions and everything, and they thought that and they had their slave culture. And then the Northerners, they were the mongrels. You can look up mongrels. Mongrels means mixed breeds, all these alien immigrants coming into the country from Ireland and from Germany and every place in the world. Later, maybe you've seen the movie the Gangs of New York. That period was about the 1850s, and in the 1850s and 60s there were hundreds of thousands of immigrants. Specifically in that movie, Leonardo DiCaprio plays a son of an Irish immigrant out to revenge his father's murder by the nativists. Well, that was the way it was in those days. Impact, this led to competition between the two sections that are very different. They're going to be very competitive, and each one is going to constantly be looking out for their own advantage, and particularly in the Congress. Then in 1793, and finally really developed, the invention of the cotton gin. I'll quickly explain what cotton is. If you know what a cotton ball, a medical cotton ball, you might have one in your home in the cabinet. But when cotton comes off the cotton vines, it is very oily and it has cotton seeds in it. And somebody has to, in those days, by hand, take out the seeds. So production was very slow. So it shows here, in 1792, only 6,000 bales of cotton produced in the South. By 1802, 100,000, because now they're using the cotton gin. And you might want to go to YouTube and just type in cotton gin to see how it operates. It's kind of neat. By 1860, at the beginning of the Civil War, 4 billion bales of cotton produced every year, almost all of it going to New England and to the English cotton, or the textile mills in England. The impact of this increased demand for cheap slave labor. The Southerners didn't want to have hired hands. They wanted cheap slave labor. I buy the slave and I own the slave. And you have to this is hard to remember or even conceive of. A slave is property. Like I own a horse, I own a cow, I own a table, and I own X number of black slaves, African American slaves. The South becomes more entrenched, stronger in the system of slavery, and at the same time, the North is becoming more opposed to the slavery. The tariffs were passed on manufactured European goods. The American government trying to, and this happens all the time. Right now we have very strong tariffs and even blocking imports from other countries to protect the flow of capital out of Ecuador, and it's the same thing. It doesn't work very good, but countries still keep trying it. So the Americans would buy cheaper American goods, but then it ruins the trade arrangements between nations. The impact, it protected the northern industries, that's true, but the South had to pay higher taxes, and even then, in 1820s and early 30s, South Carolina threatens to secede from the Union. And then in 1828, something very important, it's called nullification. John C. Calhoun was a very outspoken Southern senator, and he said that the states had the right to declare a federal law null and void, which means it's not valid in my state. It may be a federal law, but we reject the federal law or the authority of federal law over state law. In 1820, Henry Clay was instrumental. They got some kind of agreement. They would draw a line at 3630, which is called the Mason-Dixon line. And it goes along from, if you look, from Pennsylvania, the southern border of Pennsylvania, and straight across the southern border of Ohio, the northern border of Kentucky, where the Ohio River goes. That's kind of like a difference between the north of the Mason-Dixon line are free states, and south of the Mason-Dixon line are southern states, slave states. So then the new territories, as they came to, they applied to become states in the United States, could only enter two at a time, and one had to be free and one had to be slave to preserve the balance of the voting. That was a really serious, major concern at this time. It was politics. Who had more fun? Because in Congress, who makes the laws? It's the Congress. So I want more of my southern senators and congressmen. And it did keep the Civil War from beginning. It might have begun at that time. I don't think it would have, but some textbooks say so. And then there's the Abolitionist Movement. All of these to help people, one organization to help black people move back to Liberia, another society, anti-slavery, a newspaper printed by William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass publishes, Sojourner Truth fights to help black people escape the South and get to Canada up through northern Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts. And then the impact of that was the South becomes more and more and more offended by the attitude of the North helping their property run away. It's like if my horse ran away and you found my horse, your obligation is to bring my horse back to me. And that is exactly what this is about. The Fugitive Slave Law in 1850, slaveholders could regain their property if their slave ran away. They could go to the North and identify the slave, and there's a good movie out. I haven't seen it yet. I have it sitting beside me. It's 12 Years in Slavery or something like that. That you could just go up and blacks who were captured by the police and couldn't prove that they were free blacks, then the white people that come from the South could just take them back, or by the law, Northerners were supposed to catch black people and hold them until their owners could be found, which offended many, many of the Northerners. Made the North more angry, the Northern citizens were punished for following their anti-slavery consciousness. Popular sovereignty means the citizens of each new territory could vote free or slave. Sovereignty is, and this is another thing, which is the supreme sovereignty, the federal government or the state government? The settlers rushed into territory. I mentioned this before. When a territory was ready to become a state, they would rush in from other states. People from the South rush into that new territory to become a state. And eventually, by 1854, you end up with a war, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southerners coming in to fill the ballot boxes. They weren't legal voters, but that's what they did. And the blacks obviously had no rights. And then there was a guy named John Brown. John Brown was insane. I read a book about John Brown last year. Passionate, insane abolitionist who fought for freedom of the slaves in Kansas, and eventually planned a raid in West Virginia, what today is West Virginia. At that time it was Virginia, right in Harper's Ferry. I've been to this place. My sister lives about 5 miles from there. And he took over a small building that had some guns and some gunpowder and stuff like that, and he was going to help facilitate a rise up of all the slaves in the South, and it didn't work. He was surrounded by the army very quickly. Some of his people were killed, and it was a total failure, and he was hung by the neck. But he became a national hero. He was a martyr for the slavery, the freedom of the slaves. Impact scared the hell out of the Southerners. Now there are people trying to free our slaves and get guns to free our slaves, and the slaves themselves are going to rise up, which there were some minor risings of the slaves rebellions, killing white people, because the slaves far outnumbered the Southerners, the white Southerners. And they believed that the Northerners were out to get them and ruin their system. And they were right. The Underground Railroad, I already explained how the Northerners were helping people get out of the South and sneak them through different methods. There was nothing underground about it. It was through the woods and over the hills and mountains and stuff, and to get them free to Canada. This one's very important. You should remember this for this course. The Dred Scott decision. There was a black man, an educated black man. Remember, in those days it was illegal to teach your slaves to read or write. And he was the slave of a U.S. Army officer who was stationed in the South. But then the officer was transferred to, I think, Illinois or Indiana, I forget which. And then when he was transferred back to a southern state, Dred Scott, and it was a put up of the abolitionists. Someday you'll study about Rosa Parks sitting on the bus. It wasn't just a lady who was tired and wanted to sit on the bus. It was a planned rebellion against segregation. Well, this was a planned rebellion against to try to prove that a black person who had lived in the North had, simply by living there, gained their freedom, which didn't work out because the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court Chief Justice Taney disallowed the lawsuit, and Mr. Scott was declared that because he was not he lived in the States, but he was black, so he couldn't be a citizen, and a citizen had no right to bring a lawsuit against the state or against the government, the federal government, or his owner just because he had lived in a free state. This caused the abolitionists to go even more angry. What you notice here is people are getting more and more angry as the years go by. And then a lady named Harriet Beecher Stowe, she wrote a book. And you can find the book online if you go to the Gutenberg Project. And it's a book from the 1850s, but it tells a story of how bad slavery is. The evil Simon Legree is the slave master, and how he beats the black people, and people die. And it talks about the little boy and the mistreatment of him. Well, the people in the North read the book and they started screaming, howling even louder. The impact, some historians consider it a major cause of the Civil War because it aroused the people so much. The South said, that's just Yankee propaganda, and it's not true. We love our black people. They didn't call them black people. We love our little darkies and our Negroes, and we treat them very nice, but we own them. Something like that. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln is elected President of the United States in a Republican victory. The Republican Party is a new party. There was a party before, it was called the Whigs, but that no longer exists. The Democrats lose. Abraham Lincoln represents a party that says, not that they believe in freeing the slaves, but they believe in free soil. New states should be free so people can go there, and it should be no more slave states. The Southerners deeply resented it. In 1860 election, a Republican candidate for no slavery in new territories, and I don't remember, but I think it was December of 1860. I'm thinking right now. Doesn't make much difference. December of 1860 or January of 1861, South Carolina secedes from the Union. We are no longer part of the United States of America. And by January, more states, next is North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, etc., they secede and the Civil War starts. I added these couple of slides just to give you some idea. I'm trying to keep this down around less than 25 minutes for sure. We think of the United States today, we think of it as a single country, but that was not the way people thought about it, especially in the South. United States is a plural expression, which means we the people of all these states belong to one union. But that's not the way they thought. The Southerners contended that the state was a synonym for an independent government. Therefore, our state of South Carolina, North Carolina, we have supremacy. Our government has supremacy over the federal government, because that's the way it was in the Articles of Confederation. And if you remember reading about the Articles of Confederation, after several years from 1780, by 1787, they realized that the Articles of Confederation were very weak, and they couldn't govern the country that way, and that's why they wrote the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison claimed in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that states could nullify laws, but eventually this it's not implied by nullification, but the Southerners, they hung on to this idea, to protect their peculiar system, it was called. And they felt that the Northerners were very threatening to their system. North generally believed the United States was a real nation, and all this other stuff was not valid. Alexander Hamilton, and it says in one book I read, sometimes Daniel Webster, which is true, that once you ratify the Constitution, you agreed. You have a contract. You may have heard of the social contract. This is a system of government contract, and you can't just walk away from it because you don't like what's going on. You're stuck with it. And the conclusion. Generations of historians have searched for underlying causes and trying to say, what caused the failure of the United States in a civil war? And some have said that the clash of economic interests between agrarian and industrialized nations, or regions, But the main issue in the 1850s was whether slavery was right or wrong, whether it should be extended or contained, and disagreements over protective tariffs and economic things, they were always secondary. Some historians blame the crises on irresponsible politicians, of which we know there, and agitators, of which there were a plentiful supply, north and south. But it fails to understand the depth of the feeling that the slavery question aroused in the Southerners. The crisis was rooted in a profound ideological differences over the morality and utility of slavery as an institution. Most interpreters agree the fact that the South was a slave society and going to stay that way, and the North was equally committed to a free labor society. And by 1850s, you have a new Republican Party, and the Republican Party is for free soilers, which offends the Southerners very much because they're Democrats. But like I said, the Free Soil Republican Party was not for freedom for blacks, but for free states to come into the Union. We must recognize the crisis of the 1850s had both a deep social and cultural dimension and a purely political one. Beliefs and values had diverged significantly in the North and the South between 1820s and 1850s. Both sections continued to profess allegiance to their traditional Republican ideals of liberty and independence, but both were influenced, here's something else, by evangelical religion. The South embraced slavery as a foundation for their white liberty and independence. Its evangelicalism encouraged personal piety but not social reform. The North, a rising middle class, and this is very important too. There was no rising middle class in the South. It's a very hierarchical structure. The rising middle class adapted to a new market economy with the help of evangelical Christianity. And eventually the South, with its allegedly idle masters, this is what the North thought of them, degraded unfree workers and shiftless poor whites, were as a flagrant violation of Protestant work ethic. The North, the Southerners said, the North was a land of hypocritical money grubbers who denied the obvious fact that the virtue, independence, and liberty of free citizens was possible. only when dependent laboring classes, especially racially inferior ones, were kept under a kind of rigid control that only slavery could provide. And I think you might find an analogy in the way the Spanish in Ecuador and Peru treated the indigenous peoples of the countries when they came to South America. The indigenous people were a subhuman race. They were not Christians, and they therefore could be abused as much as you wanted to. That's it.